Tar Heels hosting Pitt this weekend in Kenan Stadium. I want to start big picture, and then we'll zero in on the game itself. Adam, these are really big 2 weeks for Carolina football. Pitt and Georgia Tech at home these next 2 weeks. Best case scenario, you're 5-2 after these 2 weeks, going into a bye week. That's a picture that's pretty rosy. Obviously, you would like to be 7-0, but if you're 5-2 and in this scenario, you've won your last 2 games, head into a bye week to rest up, get healthy, good record at that point with some quality wins, because I think Pitt and Georgia Tech, I know more about Pitt at this moment just because I've been preparing for them this week, but that would be a nice place to be. Not the perfect place to be, but a nice place to be. Worst case scenario, you're 3-4. And at that point, you've had an extended slide. You're going into the bye week with some very negative feelings. And that's just not, that's a dark place to be, Adam. So you can't look ahead necessarily to Georgia Tech, but you can't be 2-0 without Pitt, and you can't be 0-2 if you win this game. So, man, these feel like it just feels like these 2 games right now are going to really dictate the feelings that you have. If those feelings haven't already been dictated, I think these 2 games really are going to help dictate the feelings that you have for this season moving forward. These are 2 big ones, and it starts with Pitt on Friday or on Saturday.
And I think as we've learned in the first month of the season, it's not just the outcome that's going to dictate how people feel. It will also be, like, as we've seen, there have been some wins that people didn't feel great about. You'd like to see the Tar Heels make some progress in some key areas that have been an issue over the last couple of weeks. And the challenge in doing that is now you're facing opponents who know you very, very, very well, have seen you before. They know your personnel, they know your schemes, and you're likewise familiar with them. And it's for the Coastal Division. Oh, wait.
Not really. That part, Adam was just joshing about that part.
Old habits die hard, though. I still feel like, for some reason, I feel like Carolina and Pitt are more connected than, like, Carolina and Louisville.
Oh, there's no question. There's no question that you feel that way. I mean, these 2 teams have played every year but one, and that was the COVID season, since Pitt joined the league. So, I mean, yes, Carolina's more connected to Pitt than it is to Wake Forest at this point, in football at least. Adam, I think, I've thought a lot about the Tar Heels. And the more I think about it, the more I think this is true. And Mac Brown has said this, and I'm sure we have said it, so I don't think it's like breaking news. There are 6, 8, 10 teams that are better than everybody else. They're going to be better than everybody else because they've got more money to be better than everybody else, and that's just where it is right now. Will that change in the future? Maybe. Who knows?
That's nationally.
Yeah, I'm talking nationally, yes. And we all know who those teams are. And then there is probably 15 or 20 teams that aren't very good. And I think probably that changes over a little bit more from year to year. There may be some teams that unfortunately are there frequently, but I do think that is a little more fluid. Carolina is not in either of those piles of teams right now. And very rarely have the Tar Heels been in the pile of either one of those teams. Instead, the Tar Heels fall in the group of like 100 teams or so that are in between those 2 groups. And that big group of teams encompasses most of the Atlantic Coast Conference. There might be 1 or 2, maybe, that are not there as far as the top end. And I don't think there's just a terrible team in the league. So most of the league is in this group. I think Pitt and Carolina are both in this group, this big group of teams. and they're all about the same. They may do things differently. Their style of play might not be the same, but they're all very similar. Players are so spread out now. The game is so different now as far as roster construction. It's homogenized a lot of the game. So the things that become so important are things that are always important in football, but I think I think it's almost been increased. And these things are things that we all know. Turnovers, penalties, special teams, using your timeouts the right way. Like, these things have always been important, but I feel like they are now the determining factors more times than ever. That's not to say there can't be a blowout one week or whatever, but these things feel like they are the absolute difference makers. And these are all areas in which Carolina has struggled. The Tar Heels have turned it over 8 times this year. They've only gained 3. We've talked about penalties a bunch. Carolina was flagged 10 times last week. Now, there was some report that went out that Carolina sent in 7 of those 10 penalties to the ACC office, and the league office responded that 5 of the 7 were not correct. But guess what? Nobody cares. You got to deal with that. So we know and I feel like it's almost unfair to lump special teams into it. Like, the punt team has had trouble. Obviously, Noah Burnett's had a very good year. Carolina's covering kicks well. All of that stuff is still happening, but there's no doubt that the Tar Heels are having some issues on the punt team. And so these small things are enormous. And whether that is, as Des Evans talks about in a little bit, focus, whether that is attention to detail, I know it's something that's been talked about, but it's not where the Tar Heels want it to be. And I'm not saying if they clean up those areas that Carolina's going to win every single game the rest of the way, but I think it would go a long way to helping them have a great chance to do so, because Carolina has players good enough to win these games. Every game left on the schedule. There is not one game on the schedule that you look at and go, man, the Tar Heels are just going to be big underdogs there. There isn't. So those things are huge. And it would be, and that's why I think the Minnesota game was so encouraging, right? Like, we talked about that. Like, Carolina ended up winning that game for a lot of different reasons, but some of it was what we just talked about. They only had the 1 turnover. They didn't have a ton of penalties. They were the ones that made their kicks. The other team missed the kicks. I mean, like, that stuff makes a difference in the end, and that's where I feel like things that are in Carolina's control, that it can absolutely improve on and almost immediately have a better chance to be successful consistently.
And sort of speaking to exactly what you said, as you said, there's not a game on Carolina's schedule left where they are going to be heavy underdogs.
Not one.
There's also not a game on Carolina's schedule left where they're going to be heavy favorites.
Absolutely not.
And that's why all these things are so important. And I also think that's why when all these things have gone poorly the last 2 weeks, and especially some of them last week in a 1-point loss, that is how you lost the game.
Yeah.
It wasn't because the other team was bigger and stronger than you or had more NFL players on their roster. It was because these things that are fairly controllable, like, it's not the bounce of the ball. These things were not executed to their optimal performance. And that's how you lost. That's how you lost the game. And that is how these next 7 games will be won or lost, in a very similar way.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, you understand. I mean, we understand. Like Carolina has to run the ball more consistently in the second half. I mean, all the things that we already talked about in the Duke game itself. But these things make a difference. They do. And in this particular game, just the Duke one in particular, it was really of these things that we're talking about, the penalties. But the problem is that any one of those can be something that becomes the biggest thing. So I do feel like, again, anybody who's ever watched football, knows football, cares about football, they understand those things are important. I just feel like they're even more important now than ever before. As far as Pitt itself, Adam, this is like you dated someone for a while and then didn't see them for a bit, and then they show up and they look totally different, and you're like, what? Who is this? Is that Pitt over there in the corner? Did Pitt lose some weight over there? They are a totally different team as far as how they approach things on offense. They hired this guy named Cade Bell from Western Carolina. He graduated from college in 2015. So he is, I believe, 31 years old. A whippersnapper, Adam. And he has totally revamped what they are doing. They are, like, Pitt is a run up to the line, snap the ball fast, get in as many plays as you can, get the ball to your playmakers in space, let them go out there and juke and make guys miss tackles because they're running on grass. Phil Longo's probably somewhere so happy right now. Like, Pitt is doing this. And they're doing it really well. Eli Holstein is their quarterback, a transfer from Alabama, a redshirt freshman, 12 touchdowns, 2 interceptions so far this year. Now, he's probably had a couple of throws that could have been picked, but they weren't. He's not playing behind the best offensive line in the world, and he's still making it happen. Big guy, 6'4", 225. He can run. It's not like his main thing, but I think he's Pitt's second leading rusher, if I'm not mistaken. So he can run. He can, when the play breaks down, he can get out of trouble and go get him some yards. They don't do a ton of like design stuff necessarily for him, although they will do some. And read that RPO is a big part of what they do. Again, this is Pitt. They've got this little running back, Desmond Reed, who's listed at 5'8", 175. And people can't tackle him. Like, he is so fast and so shifty. And they get him the ball. They've done a great job in getting him the ball in space, whether that is through the run game or out of the backfield, whatever it is. And he gets out in space, and watch out. Like, Adam, you and I both know this, and people who watch a ton of, like, he's just one of those guys that for some reason guys slide off of him when they're trying to tackle him. You know what I mean? Like, he's just got this, like, wiggle to him that it's hard to take him down. He's scored a punt return touchdown this year. He's got 4 total touchdowns as a running back, and only one of them is rushing the ball. And that doesn't include the punt return. That's either receiving or rushing touchdown. So he has 5 total with that punt return in there. He did not play in their last game. That was 2 weeks ago against Youngstown State. They didn't need him. They put up 73. He's 100% healthy and expected to go. They've got some good wide receivers. Some are guys who are there that have just gotten better. Kenny Johnson has made some really impressive catches. Kanate Mumfield, who's been there for a while, an Akron transfer. He's their number one guy, good player, 20 catches through 4 games. They brought in some Western Carolina transfers, and Desmond Reed's a Western Carolina transfer, the running back I was just talking about. Sincere Lee, another one who's a good player at the running back position, at the wide receiver position that came from Western Carolina. Like, they all of a sudden are a team that has a lot of offensive weapons that they've done a really good job, in my opinion, of getting the ball to. Pat Narduzzi is still the head coach. So they remain aggressive on defense. Their defensive numbers are not as good as they have been in the past, but some of that is because their offense has been so good and because the other team has the ball more. And as we have seen from Carolina over the last several years, there is a little bit of a double-edged sword, which is so crazy to even say, but of being like so efficient on offense that your defense is out there so much that eventually they are going to give up more yardage and potentially points just because they're out there so much. So, Adam, I think this is a really good team. 2 of their 4 wins are against FCS teams. So that's obviously Kent State. Wait, no, Kent State's not FCS, right? But they are no, they're in the MAC. But they are not very – Kent State is not good, and they beat Youngstown State, who is FCS. Their other 2 wins are at Cincinnati and against West Virginia. It's quality teams. Pitt's needed, I would almost say, miraculous comebacks in both to win it, but they've won it. They've done it. So I think they think that people think – I think they think that people think they aren't as good as their record says. And they're coming off a bye week, so I think they're coming to Chapel Hill, first ACC game. They've created a chip on their own shoulder by saying, oh, you're 4-0, but people don't think you're really good enough to be 4-0, so let's go show them we're good enough. And they've got some really impressive stuff offensively that they put you in a bind. You got to tackle in space. Tar Heels had trouble tackling not in space against Duke. So that's going to be important. Carolina, this is one of the games that we just talked about. This is a 50-50 game in my opinion, but the Tar Heels are going to have to take their 50 and a little bit more to have a chance to win it.
This type of personality change would have taken like 3 or 4 years in past generations of college football. You would have needed multiple recruiting classes in order to make this type of significant change. Now you just do it in off season. Now, I think Pat Narduzzi may have been a little concerned about his job, so he had to make some coaching changes.
Oh, there was a massive overhaul on the coaching staff for Pitt for sure. They've been good. I mean, they've been good changes at least to this point.
Well, I do think you have to give him credit. I mean, this doesn't strike me as the way Pat Narduzzi really wants to play.
I agree with that.
But he's doing it.
Yep.
And winning so far. I do think the schedule's a bit of a question. Hopefully this isn't all a scheme to get them to their bye week when they reinstalled like the power game.
Right.
I don't think that's the case. But it's another team coming off a bye week, so you'll see a wrinkle or two. They will be very competitive. Pat Narduzzi will be obnoxious on the sideline because that's his thing. And they'll be well coached. He's a good coach.
Oh, I mean, and they were 3-9 last year. So my guess is that they felt like they needed to make some changes or some changes would be made. I mean, 5 new assistants, including the offensive coordinator. And to your point, I mean, that quarterback, Holstein, was a top 150 player in high school. That doesn't guarantee success. We've all seen plenty of highly recruited guys that for whatever reason didn't pan out. But, I mean, this is a guy who picked Alabama over like Arkansas and Auburn and Florida and Georgia and LSU and A&M. And so some good programs wanted him. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out in Alabama, and now it is working out for him in a big way at Pitt. And, I mean, like I mentioned Desmond Reed, he's second in the nation in all-purpose yards per game at like 188. So he wasn't available last week, so Daniel Carter just came in and rushed for 109 yards and had 3 total touchdowns. So I think they've got some good play. Their skill guys are shockingly good for Pitt. And I don't mean that. I just mean for what you are used to seeing from Pitt, which is kind of slower and more power-oriented. And it is just totally different, which was a little shocking to the system to see. I mentioned those two games against Cincinnati and West Virginia, they were down 27-6 with about 5 minutes left in the third quarter at Cincinnati and came back and won it. And then they were down 34-24 with 3 minutes and 15 seconds left against West Virginia and won it. So, and they were down 10 and facing a 2nd and 30 and came back and won it with 3:15 to go. So they've had some really remarkable comebacks to win those two games against the other power conference teams that they've played. But they still, again, they did it. They blocked a punt in the game against West Virginia that they picked up for a touchdown. So keep that in mind. We know the Tar Heels have had some issues there. I think it's a really solid team that has had a lot of success here early. I do think this will be their best challenge or their biggest challenge to this point. But I also think that they are, like I said, I think they've kind of hyped themselves up into being ready to accept this challenge in the lens of no one believes in you, go show them who you really are.
And I think, unfortunately, we're faced with a little uncertainty as to which version of Carolina they're going to see. I mean, if the Tar Heels had finished things out last week, we would be having a different discussion because I think there'd be a lot more question about Pitt's schedule than we currently have. But because the Tar Heels didn't finish things out, we don't know. I mean, are you going to get second half Carolina or first half Carolina? First half Carolina can easily win the game. Second half Carolina, and really that's like last quarter and a half, will struggle against this team. But I mean, you also got to remember, like, this version of Pitt is better equipped to put up big numbers against smaller teams. So I think we're all accustomed.
That's a good point.
We're all accustomed to seeing like methodical old Pitt, like plod by an outclassed opponent like 30-14. Well, now they can put up 70.
Right.
Because they play differently, and no one's seen this before from them. So I do think there's a certain element of that in the credentials that they've built to this point. But the most important credential they have is they've played 4 games and they've won all 4.
Yeah. We talked to Des Evans about this in a second. But I do think it is worth mentioning. Like, Carolina was very clearly like ready to go last week, right? I mean, they had been embarrassed the week before. They started the game well. And that's a credit to them. I think it gets harder to do when you don't have success for a couple games in a row. And so can Carolina, from those kind of intangible, away from the actual action on the field, you know, where is its mindset right now? I think that'll be something to keep an eye on. And if things go poorly at any point, and we've talked about, I mean, Carolina's got to figure out a way to stem the tide. And we talked about this some on Monday or on Tuesday's show. And the more I thought about it, I realized that we were wrong in a sense that they did make one tide stemming play. They got that 4th down stop that gave them the ball with the lead at their own 40. But the problem was then they immediately gave it right back. The more I think about it, Adam, that one moment I think was the biggest moment in that Duke game. Was when Carolina had that game-changing momentum play of getting the 4th down stop, you're up 6 with the ball at your 40, and you get those double penalties. The more I think about it, the more I think that was it. That was the moment in that game. And now, again, Duke still had to go score, and I mean, all those. I'm not taking anything away, but that was the moment that it ended. Carolina's best chance in that game.
And to your point, when this discussion started, that was a self-inflicted moment.
Self-inflicted.
Duke didn't do that to Carolina.
No,
the Tar Heels did that to themselves.
So noon, we're on the air at 11 a.m. for Carolina and Pittsburgh. And, boy, these have traditionally been close games. You know, since Pitt joined the league, They've played 10 times, these two, and 8 of them have been decided by a touchdown or less. So this has traditionally been a very close game. Pitt has never won in Chapel Hill. I don't know if that's a big deal to them or not. But they'll be excited to come here with a team that they feel like has an opportunity to win.
Joe Yock in the
booth.
Okay.
For this one. I mean, Pitt is averaging 523 yards per game. They're 6th in the country in yards per game. They're 5th in the country in points per game. I understand, but that's shocking to see.
Let's check those numbers again on November 1st. They may be for real. They might be the best team in the league. We don't know for sure yet because of the schedule.